Good morning or good afternoon, everybody, depending on where you're zooming in with us today from. I wanted to thank you all for joining us today on this very special edition of METALCON Online, being co-presented by the MCA. Today's session is titled Understanding and Explaining the Energy Efficiency and Condensation Dynamics of Metal Roofing and Wall Panels. It's going to be presented by Todd Miller, who is a seasoned professional in the industry and the president of AIA Industries. As you may have heard, METALCON is coming to Atlanta a little later on this year. We highly encourage you, if you're planning on joining us, book your hotel now and save money. Last year, we did run out of hotel rooms, so we highly encourage anyone who is attending, book early and guarantee your space. Coming up next on METALCON Live, join us on Wednesday, May 15th. On Wednesday, May 15th, we will be joined by the Future Leaders Association and future leaders of METALCON and the MCA as they present the Metal Construction Industry 101. It's going to be a very basic outlook on various aspects of the industry, really that true 101 course. That session will be presented by not only Ryan King of Sidey and Machinery. Todd Miller will also be there. I'll be there with you as well, along with Zanat of the MCA and a few other special presenters. We're very excited for that one, and we encourage you to send all of your future leaders or individuals under the age of 40 or those new to the industry to that session. METALCON registration is open now, and we also have our biggest savings available right now until May 10th. So highly encourage everyone, go and register. If you plan on attending, you can save up to $50 if you register by May 10th. Again, that is May 10th for your registration price lock. All information and additional information can be found on the metalcon.com website. METALCON is very pleased to be coming to you from the Georgia World Congress Center this year. We have tons of education being presented. We will have hundreds of exhibitors and some very cool surprises coming your way shortly. Highly encourage everyone to register early so you can A, save money, B, be on the cusp of all cool and new information coming your way about the show, and C, just to get in early. It makes it a lot easier to organize. Last but not least, I want to remind everyone to please fill in the survey at the end of this session so that way you can receive your credit and auto-download that certificate. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns today, please feel free to fill in the chat box or the Q&A section, and we will be more than happy to answer any questions you have. Again, if you have any technical issues, reach out to me directly, METALCON Online, and I'll be happy to help you with those as well. Without further ado, I'm going to hand this over to our seasoned veteran for the day, Todd Miller. Todd, go ahead and take it away.
Thank you so much, Kaylin. I appreciate it. And let me get my screen shared here and get everything all set up. So thank you very much. I appreciate you referring to me as seasoned rather than just old. So I can appreciate that. I hope everyone can see my screen. I am showing the METALCON Online slide there. So
we're seeing it.
There we go. So thank you again for tuning into this webinar brought to you by METALCON Online and also Metal Construction Association. My name is Todd Miller. My company is AIA Industries. It's a pleasure to spend some time with you today. I have about 40 years of experience. That's that seasoned thing in the metal roofing industry as a manufacturer. During that time, I've worked a great deal within the industry to try to create awareness and desire for metal roofing amongst property owners out there. So most of my focus has been on residential metal roofing, and that's a lot of what I'll talk about today, but the principles I'm going to discuss will apply to other principles or other markets as well. I will be talking primarily about two topics today. Those topics are energy efficiency and also condensation control. While there may be some crossover to my discussion between the two topics, I'm going to start out talking about energy efficiency. So let me sort of preface this by saying that energy efficiency is something that really pretty much every building material out there tries to sell today. And that's a trend that started gosh, 50 years ago, back in the 70s. And in fact, today, I think most property owners will kind of assume that your product is going to be energy efficient. But the reality is that many of the roofing materials out there that we in the metal industry compete with today really don't do anything to help lower the operating costs of the property owner's utilities. But even with the products that are energy efficient, such as metal products, I oftentimes think that contractors aren't really the best at explaining the why of energy efficiency. So that kind of leaves a gap in consumer education. And I also think it leaves a huge opportunity for contractors who can fill that gap with credible, straightforward, reliable, factual detail. It can allow them to really clean up as they promote their products against their competition. So my encouragement to you is to make sure that your sales team understands the dynamics of these topics and that they can explain them well to prospective customers. So going back to the mid 80s, as a manufacturer of residential metal roofing, my company started to get curious about why the homeowners who put metal roofs on their homes would often report energy savings after that new roof was installed. And this again goes back 40 years ago. What we kept hearing even back then was that they were realizing summer energy savings of 20%, sometimes even more. So in the mid 80s, my company went and contracted with an organization down at Cape Canaveral called Florida Solar Energy Center to help us understand the dynamics of this energy efficiency so that we could reliably talk to future customers about it and tell them what they could expect in terms of energy performance of a metal roof. Honestly, what we learned back then all seems pretty basic to us now. But the reality is, back then, we really didn't understand what was going on. And even after we got some of the experts involved, like the folks down at Florida Solar Energy, we still found ourselves sometimes going down wrong paths as we worked to figure all this out. So eventually, of course, we did figure out, at least to where it is today, to the point of where reflective metal roofing even became part of the Department of Energy's Energy Star rating program. But I want to talk a little bit about some of those early findings that we had. So as I mentioned, our very first energy study was performed by Florida Solar Energy Center, and they tested a product we have called rustic shingle, which is a deeply formed aluminum shake. Back then, it was just a pretty basic water-based finish, and it was in a dark brown color. So this was long before the reflective pigment that we've talked a lot about the last 20 years or so. The result of that test back in the 80s was that they did prove that less heat was getting into the structure than would have gotten into it with other types of roofing materials. So back then, when it came to energy efficiency, the only thing we knew to talk about was R value. So after they did their research and came up with their numbers and all this stuff, we asked them, how does this all relate to an R value? Their response was that the metal shingle that they tested was behaving similar or the same as how an R11 insulation would behave, or accomplishing the same thing as an R11 insulation if that insulation was installed on top of the roof. Frankly, at that time, because what we were testing was an aluminum product, we kind of thought that one of the driving forces behind that energy efficiency was the low emissivity of aluminum and other metals as well. We knew that aluminum was naturally reflective of heat, and also we knew that it would quickly lose any gained heat back to the sky or the air around it, as soon as the heat source, the sun, went behind a cloud or went down at night, or even when a cool wind blew. A great example of what we were all familiar with and what we kept trying to relate this to is that aluminum foil wrapped baked potato. You know that when you pull it out of the oven, you keep the foil on there and it keeps that potato extremely hot and even keeps baking. But you also know that while that aluminum would be hot to the touch, as soon as you separated it from the surface of the potato, it cooled down virtually instantly. 1 second, it would be too hot to touch. And the next second, you could touch it and wad it up into a ball or do whatever you wanted to with it. But then, as we talked about that, and then we started going out and talking to chemists, we were told something else that really confused us for a while. Aluminum, yes, and other metals have low emissivity, but the paint that was being applied to these products to give them color actually had very high emissivity. So you had two materials there coming together. Looking back now again, it kind of seems silly that we didn't intuitively realize what was going on. But a good portion of the energy efficiency that we saw in that initial test with Florida Solar Energy Center was actually coming from what we now call a thermal break. A thermal break is an air gap or an insulating material that is strategically placed between highly conductive materials to interrupt that flow of thermal energy or that flow of heat. So here we got this metal shingle. There was a dead airspace between the metal and the structure or the roof deck itself. That was caused by the formation of the metal shingle product. And that created a thermal break. Now, today, thermal breaks are one of the biggest areas of study of building science and thermal efficiency. But back then, we weren't even thinking about thermal breaks in terms of roof and wall system performance. Today, you're going to find lots of options for creating thermal breaks between the exterior skin of a building to the interior. Thermal breaks, again, they can be an airspace, they can be an insulating material designed simply to break up that flow or that conductive flow of heat or energy from the outside of the building to the inside. Anytime you can do that through a thermal break, it's going to be a good thing in a structure. Thermal breaks, of course, were back in the 70s and 80s being used quite a bit in windows. So you had windows being produced with double and triple pane glass, and you could go to any home show at the time and see a standard single pane window next to a double pane window, and they'd have this big bank of red hot heat bulbs behind it shining through. And as you walk past the single pane glass, you were just getting baked. But when you walk past that double pane glass, you didn't feel the heat coming through. And that double pane was stopping that heat transfer. So what was happening was that while the outer pane of glass was being heated up, that outer pane of glass, for the most part, touched only a dead airspace that existed between the two panes of glass. And that dead airspace was stopping the conductive flow of heat from one piece of glass to the next. Had the two panes of glass been tightly sandwiched and not been separated, the heat would have flowed right from one into the next. And keep in mind that air gap doesn't have to be very much. In fact, typically in a window, it's going to be 1/3 of an inch or less as far as the air gap between those panes of glass. But any separation at all stops conductive heat transfer. So I want to go on now and kind of talk about the three basic types of heat transfer. These are the three ways in which heat is transferred from its source to something else. One is what we just discussed, conduction. One material that gets warmed touches another material and it conducts heat from itself to the other material. The method, as we talked about, of stopping this is to have a thermal break, often again, an airspace or some sort of insulating material that separates those two materials. Another method of heat transfer is what we call radiation. This is how heat, in essence, passes through materials and warms airspace. It strikes a material, it warms it, and then heat radiates off that material to warm the surrounding air. Now, you feel this on a bright sunny day, you're inside a building and you walk past a window and the sun is shining through, you can feel the radiant heat of that sun warming the air around you. Another example of radiant heat is you take a brick building. So a brick building sits there all day and it becomes a heat sink, storing the heat from the sun. And then for hours after the sun has gone down, you can still feel the heat radiating off that brick, both to the outside and some of it's radiating to the inside of the structure as well. Again, that is heat transfer by radiation. Radiant heat transfer is stopped by radiant barriers, such as foil. And we're going to talk more about that. The final method of heat transfer is convection. Convection is something we all learned in science class in 3rd grade. That's how warm air rises because warm air is lighter, less dense, if you will, than cool air. In a structure, of course, that usually means that that warm air ends up rising to the attic or the top floor of the building. Convective airflow also plays a role in condensation, and we're going to talk about that, of course, a little bit. But in buildings, we take advantage of convective airflow by providing ventilation that as that air ends up in the attic or wherever at the top of the building, we provide ventilation that allows that air to exhaust or to escape out of the building. So I want to get back real quick to those early roofing studies. And one of our first discoveries was that metal shingles, which again have a formed shape to them that naturally creates a thermal break between the the surface of the roof and the structure. We found that metal shingles were more energy efficient than metal roofs that have a lot of contact directly with the roof deck, such as a standing seam system or a corrugated or exposed fasten product. Standing seam roofs would conduct rooftop heat direct to the structure, while the formed metal shingles with an integral or integrated airspace between the metal and the roof deck did not conduct that heat to the same degree. So if you can break up the conduction or flow of heat from that material closest to the heat source, the sun, you can break up the flow of that heat to other materials, you're going to keep heat out of the structure during hot weather, which is going to reduce the need for air conditioning. So I want to move on a bit now from conductive heat flow, and let's talk about radiant heat transfer a bit. One of the things that building science had known for many years was that lightly colored roofs or white roofs were better at reflecting heat than were dark colored roofs. For that reason, white roofs have been used for many years in tropical and subtropical areas for the purpose of keeping those buildings naturally cooler. Now, in the early 1990s, military and aerospace technology that came about that allowed for dark pigments to be tweaked so that they would have radiant barrier properties. So you could now suddenly, even with a dark color, you could reflect some of that radiant heat. And this really was a game changer. It meant that you could now get some degree of solar reflectivity even from a dark color. So from a practical standpoint, what did that mean? Well, the color white naturally has an SRI number, and SRI stands for Solar Reflectance Index, which is the measurement of a surface's ability to reflect radiant heat. So white naturally has an SRI of about 100. A perfect SRI would, or excuse me, of about 65. A perfect SRI would be about 100. White is around 65. The dark colors that we were using prior to the development of these new reflective pigments usually had an SRI of around 5, 3, maybe 7, someplace in the mid to low single digits. Colors like tans and grays then would fall kind of between that low of 5 and the high of 65 with white. But suddenly, with these new pigments that were made available to our industry, we were able to get SRI numbers in the 25 range for very dark colors, even black. And again, that was a game changer. Over time, that technology did improve some so that we could get numbers up close to 30, even in those dark and black colors. Colors like tans and lighter grays, even reds and greens that use this technology could then get SRI numbers typically in the 30s, sometimes in the 40s. Now, those numbers still aren't as good as the natural SRI number of white, which is around 65, but they're considerably better than the single digit numbers we had gotten prior to these reflective pigments being introduced. And at the end of the day, my advice to a property owner, if you don't want a white roof, don't buy a white roof just for its energy efficiency, but instead look for a roof that is the color you want, but make sure that it has reflective pigment, and perhaps take advantage of some other ways to achieve energy efficiency, such as that thermal break. I think it's interesting to note, at least it interests me, that with this technology, these reflective pigments, the SRI of white that 65 number really could not be improved upon. In essence, when creating colors with reflective pigment, it is the black pigment primarily that they have tweaked for this reflectivity. So darker colors, which inherently have more black pigment, could be improved more dramatically than lighter colors. And white, of course, has no black pigment in it, so it really couldn't be improved upon at all. So for a little extra history, when this cool color technology, as we often called it, began to be developed back in the early 90s, it was being promoted. It was available at higher cost. Over time, though, the industry accepted and switched so much to it that it just sort of became the norm in higher quality finishes, and it was naturally included with higher quality paint systems that are used on quality metal roofs. As this technology developed, building science and energy efficiency researchers really started to take note of what was going on with these reflective metal roofs. Even though we'd known for many years that metal roofs could be energy efficient, because of the heat handling characteristics of the metal itself, and also by incorporating a thermal break, it really was reflective pigment that put cool metal roofing on the map. This was the cool science, if you will, that drew attention to what we were doing as an industry. And as I mentioned earlier, Energy Star included a reflective roofing component in their energy efficient rating categories. To meet their criteria, they required an SRI number of 25 or greater. And for many years, there was actually a federal tax credit available for homeowners and even some owners of commercial properties who chose reflective metal roofs that met these Energy Star standards. Eventually, though, because those cool colors became so common in the metal roofing industry, Energy Star actually sunsetted the program for roof ratings. And the bad thing for that was they were the criteria being used for the federal tax credit. So once Energy Star went away, the federal tax credit went away as well because they had no rating system. So that said, if you are selling or promoting or you are using a metal roof panel that has an SRI number of 25 or greater, you can certainly be assured that that product meets the former Energy Star standard for reflective roofing. One of the things, though, that we commonly get asked when we talk about radiant heat transfer is whether adding a reflective barrier somehow to a structure can help with the building's overall energy efficiency. The answer is yes, they can. But to be effective, a radiant barrier must not be trapped in a tight sandwich of materials. For example, if you put a simple reflective synthetic underlayment beneath a standing seam roof and sandwich the standing seam roof right on top of it, that's not going to be effective. Heat's going to be conducted right from the surface of the standing seam roof through the radiant barrier and onto the structure. However, if you put the standing seam panels on top of battens and then you put a radiant barrier underneath that, or even a light colored underlayment beneath the battens, that will have a positive impact. Likewise, a radiant barrier that's been strapped up or stapled up to the rafters in an attic is going to have benefit. Again, though, a radiant barrier trapped in a tight sandwich of building materials is just going to end up conducting that heat, not reflecting it. Now, some of the radiant barriers used today in building envelopes consist of the typical shiny radiant barrier material, but it's been laminated to an open cell foam or a bubble wrap type of material. In that case, that open cell foam or that bubble wrap material is creating a small airspace that is just enough to make the radiant barrier be effective, even though it is used in a sandwich of materials. Other ways of doing the same thing could be mounting the standing seam roof on battens or incorporating an entangled mesh beneath the standing seam. These are all assemblies that can create an effective thermal break to not only make your radiant barrier be more effective, but to also stop conductive heat transfer. Now, the final type of heat transfer we're going to talk about is convective airflow. As I mentioned earlier, this is the principle that hot air rises. This is why hot air balloons go up in the sky. Hot air rises because it's less dense than cold air, meaning it weighs less and therefore it floats, it rises. As heat is created or collected inside of a living space, convective airflow is going to carry that heat into higher levels of a structure. Ultimately, with typical residential construction, it means it ends up in the attic. Metal roofs, however, typically include the option of exhaust ventilation systems that can then allow that heat to exhaust out of the structure to escape the attic and go back to the outside. As a contractor, you're going to, if that is your position in this industry, you're going to be serving your customers very well if you help them analyze their home and or whatever structure they have, if you help them analyze its ventilation. You want to do things like verify that the intake vents in their soffits aren't blocked by insulation, and that air can flow through them. That is certainly a first step. You want to evaluate the NFA, the net free air that can pass through those intake vents, and you want to compare that to the code requirement in your area. Of course, you're also going to size the exhaust vents on the roof to match. But if you don't have adequate intake vent to match code, I encourage you to do the right thing and make a recommendation to that property owner, along with a proposal to get their intake ventilation functioning properly. And then you also finish that out with having the right exhaust vents to get that air vented out as well. Ventilation is a whole subject of its own, but generally speaking, what you're trying to do is have the same amount of intake vent as you do exhaust vent. So you just continually feed in fresh air, let it go out at the top, and at the same time, it carries out any heat or moisture that is building up in that attic. Reality is you're going to put your company considerably above the competition when you can talk knowledgeably about ventilation, and you can become that property's owner's guide to understanding ventilation. Proper and functioning ventilation helps to make a structure more energy efficient, which then reduces ongoing operating costs year after year. Additionally, proper ventilation helps to make a structure healthier, protecting it from mold. The reality is mold is big business these days and one of the most heavily litigated areas of construction. Mold lawsuits today are the asbestos lawsuits of the 80s and 90s. By ignoring things in a structure you work on that may lead them to have mold, you are putting your company at risk of someday being sued over the poor performance of that structure. And you don't want to go there. So do the right thing, be proactive. If you recognize high potential for mold in a structure, but yet those homeowners refuse to take your advice or do anything about it, either avoid the job completely or at the very least, require them to sign a very clear waiver that will release your company from any future liability if problems occur. Keep in mind, though, a waiver may not help you. It may protect you with that owner, but it doesn't necessarily protect you from a future property owner who may want to come back and point fingers at you also. So in summary, as you talk to your prospective customers about energy efficiency, part of your explanation needs to cover those three types of heat transfer: conduction, radiation, and convection. You're going to want to explain how the quality metal roof that you're presenting to them addresses each type of heat transfer in order to create the ultimate in terms of an energy efficient roof system for their home or other building. Now, I want to tell you a little bit about an interesting study that we had done a few years ago. This was also done by Florida Solar Energy Center, and this was done in the very early days of This was done in the very early days of reflective pigment, coatings that had reflective pigment in them. So we had a brown press-formed metal shingle compared and tested side by side to these other products, one which included a white standing seam. Now, that brown metal shingle, again, this is the early days of reflective pigment, had an SRI of 17, while the white standing seam system had an SRI of 65. Despite being considerably less reflective, that brown metal shingle was actually keeping the attic cooler than the white standing seam, as you see here. Mid-attic temperature with the brown metal shingle was 98.4 degrees. Mid-attic temperature with the standing seam white was 102.2 degrees. And this strongly proved out the idea that a thermal break or a dead airspace somehow achieved in the roof system is going to help stop conductive heat transfer and keep heat out of the attic. So either using a product that has an inherent thermal break, such as a metal shingle, or doing something with a standing seam or other vertical panel roof that allows for even a very small thermal break between the metal and the roof deck is going to achieve results similar to what you see here on this chart. You want to be the contractor that discusses this with your clients and gives them some good recommendations. So a question comes up, what kind of energy savings can a property owner expect when they install a quality metal roof that maybe has a reflective coating, includes a thermal break, and they've also allowed for good attic ventilation? I would always refer you back to the manufacturer of the roof or wall panels you're installing to get any actual test or field data that they have to support energy efficiency. Quality manufacturers are typically going to have this information readily available to share with companies like yours that are selling and installing their products. Also, exact energy results are going to depend a great deal upon the property owner's own practices inside their homes. However, over the years, the number that I have seen most commonly is that cooling costs drop by about 20% during the cooling seasons after a proper metal roof was installed. I've had folks report up to 35%. I've had folks say 15%. But an average seems to be around 20%. So as an example of this, I want to show you this house. This home is owned out in Phoenix by a retired Arizona State professor. He replaced his former wood shake roof with an aluminum shake roof. And I have to say that generally speaking, as far as energy efficiency, wood shake roofs are fairly energy efficient compared to some products because they have so many gaps and they actually breathe a great deal. But despite having replaced a wood shake roof, and when he put on his metal roof, he tracked his energy bills over the next year, and he found that his energy costs were reduced by 25% after the new roof went on. Again, this roof is in the Phoenix area. So of course, this homeowner has virtually a 12-month cooling season. So talking about and demonstrating energy savings can be very beneficial as a way to help your customers justify their metal roof investment. After you present how the energy efficiency of your product works and the typical energy savings reported by either your own past customers or other past customers, that maybe you've gotten that information from the manufacturer, you can ask your prospects something like this. With all this information I just shared, what percentage do you think you will save on your energy bill? And so you take that percentage they give you, and chances are if you told them, hey, an average percentage runs between 20% and 35%, they're probably going to pick low end and say, well, let's go with 20%, the low end of what you said. So then you're going to ask them what their typical energy bill is. You're going to multiply that 20% times their energy bills. And then you're going to reply with something like, so without a metal roof, you will be spending X dollars more per month on your electric bill than you need to. Does that seem reasonable to you? Now, notice how I phrased that. I didn't say how much money they're going to save, But instead, I phrased it in terms of how much extra money they're going to have to spend if they don't get a metal roof. Additionally, as a closing tool, you can help them look at the cost per year of a metal roof investment over time compared to whatever other product they might be considering. And, we talk about things like total cost of ownership, kind of help to break down, okay, how much are your different roof options going to cost you per year? You can run those numbers out over 25, 30 years, sometimes even less, and you can show them significant cost benefit to a metal roof. And of course, to further enhance those savings, you can add, or to further enhance the drama of those numbers, you can add in the energy savings that they can anticipate with their new roof. And you can even add in for any extra home value that they agree they will probably achieve by putting a quality metal roof on their home. So to kind of wrap up this energy efficiency part of our discussion today, you will be ahead of your competition if, rather than just saying that a product is energy efficient, you go into the details of how it is energy efficient. Chances are your competitors are not doing that. They're just throwing out some numbers and saying, yeah, it's going to save you energy, but they don't really explain how or why. And so you can be the professional, the guide that explains the how and the why. And again, with roofing, to do that, you're going to explain the three types of heat transfer: conduction, radiation, and also convection. And you're going to talk about how your metal roof addresses each of those in a positive way. And then you're going to guide them as they consider just how much extra money they will be spending on their energy bills year after year after year if they don't choose a quality metal roof as their next roof. So one more thing, after you talk about how a metal roof or wall panel can keep heat outside of their home during the summer, property owners often, especially up north, often get curious, well, what does this mean in the winter? Could it even have a detrimental effect on my energy bills to put a cool metal roof on my home by, maybe somehow making my house colder during the winter? Fortunately, even though that is kind of a natural place people start to wonder about, so you have to address it. Fortunately, that's not the case. With most normal construction, a metal roof isn't going to have any impact on the winter efficiency at all. Dynamics are a little bit different with walls, but generally that's the case with them as well. Putting a metal skin on doesn't really have any impact on the thermal performance of that building during the winter season. As I explained to property owners, what you always want to do is you want to isolate heat as close to its source as possible. In the summer, that's why the roof is a great and effective place to keep heat out of the building, because the roof is the closest thing to the heat source, the sun. In the winter, though, you're trying to keep that heat in, and the best thing that you can possibly do to that is to provide insulation as close to the conditioned space as possible. That typically is going to mean the insulation on top of your ceilings and also in the walls. The reality is, with conventional construction, if that attic on that structure is vented per code requirements, building code requirements, that attic temperature is actually going to be very close to the ambient outside temperature throughout the winter. That, again, is why insulation on top of those ceilings or in the walls is so important. Once the heat from the conditioned space, the living space, gets through that insulation and up into the attic, it's going to be carried out by ventilation. There's nothing that roof can possibly do to keep holding that heat in. Again, ventilation, that's what it does. It carries that heat out when it comes from the living space as well. Same thing goes for any heat that's gained through the roof system in the winter, though, as well. You're not going to heat your house with heat from the sun during the winter. That's not going to happen that way. And again, that heat that is gained into the attic from the sun is again going to be quickly vented outside if that home is ventilated per code in the attic. So let's go ahead and move on. We're going to talk a little bit now about condensation, the second topic here today. Now, back in the summer of 2021, I did a METALCON live session titled Condensation, the Why and How to Avoid It. That session is still out there on YouTube. You can easily find it. It's been viewed quite a number of times at this point. And it has a very in-depth explanation of condensation and roof systems. I would suggest that you go back and view that session if this is something you want to know a whole lot more about. Today, I'm just going to hit some of the high points regarding condensation and how to talk to homeowners about it. So I think it's important to keep in mind your prospect, your homeowner, property owner, whoever you're talking about, may have some misperceptions about metal roofing and condensation, or maybe just some misperceptions about condensation in general. So those are things that you have to address. And I didn't mention this earlier, probably should have. But I didn't mention this earlier, but really, chances are your homeowner probably has some wrong ideas about metal roofing and how it handles heat flow as well. Many homeowners, because they know that metal can get hot to the touch, will assume that a metal roof is actually going to make their house hot. Of course, as we discussed earlier and went through all those details on, that's not the case at all. In fact, that metal roof will save them energy. But there are always misperceptions on the part of individuals that you have to correct. And so that, again, is where taking this consultative, this educational approach to sales allows you to guide that consumer to correct information and help to guide them to making the right choice for them and their home. In regards to condensation, though, chances are they have seen condensation gather on metal objects tons of time in their life. So somehow, in their mind, that makes them think that metal might actually create those droplets of moisture. And we're going to talk a little bit about that today. But the reason that condensation is so very visually apparent on hard objects like metal or glass is that it can't be absorbed into those items, so it ends up sitting on top in the form of condensation droplets. Temperature and humidity differentials really are what cause condensation, and they will cause condensation in softer materials like woods or fabrics or even paper and cardboard. But because those materials don't have this solid surface, the condensation actually drives into the material itself and is absorbed there. So you don't see these droplets of condensation sitting on those soft materials the way that you do see them sitting on very hard and solid materials. So because folks have seen condensation droplets on metal at various times in their lives, they can sometimes begin to think that metal sweats or that it creates moisture. So that's a notion that you really have to dispel. And the reality of what happens here is really pretty simple. So I'm going to make it as simple as I can here. As we talked about earlier, warm air is less dense or lighter than cold air. Because of its lower density, warm air has more space to carry humidity and moisture, to carry that vapor. Also, as we discussed earlier, convective airflows will carry that warm, moisture-laden air upward in a structure. At this point, keep in mind, and this is where a lot of times folks get confused, we're not talking about moisture from the outside. We're actually talking about moisture that we generate inside of a structure. Things as simple as breathing put moisture into the air. House plants put moisture into the air. Damp crawl spaces or basements will increase humidity levels in a structure. And of course, there are more obvious things that we do, like laundry and bathing, showering, cooking. Those all create moisture inside of the living space as well. And of course, that's why it's so critical for those types of moisture from those sources like laundry rooms and bathrooms and kitchens. That's why we always want to make sure we have plumbing stacks that exhaust or carry that moisture fully to the outside. Sometimes you'll get into homes and that moisture from the dryer is just being dumped into the attic. And you are, again, doing that homeowner a disservice if you don't address this with them and say, hey, we got to get that brought to the outside to make sure that, we keep your attic healthy, don't end up with mold and excess of moisture and things building up there. So again, you want to get that moisture to the outside as quickly as possible. So we create this moisture-laden air inside of our living space. And again, it's going to be carried by convective airflow. It's always going to be trying to drive to the outside. So moisture always tries to go from a damp state of high humidity to a dry state. It's always trying to drive that direction. And so it may be trying to drive through the walls, but chances are a lot of it's going to end up in the attic, again, carried by convective airflow. Well, here's the problem. If that warm, moisture-laden air hits a cool surface along its path to the outside, that air is going to contract very quickly. Again, cold air is more dense and heavy than warm air. So when that warm air contracts as it hits a cold surface, that moisture ends up being forced out of it. There's no longer a place for that water vapor in the warm air. So you no longer have it as a gas or a vapor, but now it is actually formed into a liquid in the form of condensation droplets. And like I said, those condensation droplets will be readily available, or excuse me, readily visible, very prominent on a solid material that they can't soak into, such as metal or glass. So in many cases, if the attic has inadequate ventilation, this means you end up with condensation on the underside of the roof deck. Again, warm, moist air originates in the living space, trying to drive its way to a drier state, hits that cool surface of the roof deck, and it condenses. In the winter, if you live up north, you've seen this in the winter, you'll actually see it end up as frost on the underside of the roof deck because it condenses and immediately freezes. And a metal roof can somewhat exacerbate this because of how that metal roof can keep that roof deck cooler than it might have been with other roofing materials. So there have been occasions I've seen folks say, nothing changed. They put my metal roof on. No one changed the ventilation. I didn't change anything. Never used to have problems with condensation in my attic. And now suddenly I do. Again, the reason is that metal roof is dropping that roof deck temperature a little bit, just enough to sort of become the straw that breaks the camel's back and allows that moisture to condense there. Again, the problem really is not, or the real root to the problem here is that there's not adequate ventilation, and that puts that home at high risk of condensation. And of course, if you're getting condensation up in that attic, now you're going to be at high risk of mold and rot and things that follow condensation. Again, the problem is not the metal roof. Yes, the metal roof dropped that deck temperature a little bit, but that's not really the problem. The problem is a lack of ventilation in the attic. Now, in situations where there is limited opportunity to put ventilation in a structure, there are a couple of things that can be done that don't replace ventilation, but they can be helpful. Again, I kind of think of this as you never know exactly what's going to be the straw that breaks the camel's back and causes condensation that wasn't there before. Might a metal roof drop the roof deck temperature enough to cause condensation that didn't used to be there? Possibly. But by the same token, there are a couple of things that you can do that can tip that scale the other way. One of those is the thermal break. So we've talked about it. A metal shingle has an integral thermal break between the metal and the roof deck. That will not drop that roof deck temperature as much as a metal roof that has a lot of direct to deck contact does. Likewise, a standing seam or exposed fastener metal roof put up on battens or even on raised clips. There's a lot of companies coming out with different ways to create that thermal break beneath a vertical seam metal roof. Just doing that can also be very helpful. Again, you eliminate that direct contact of the metal to the roof deck and you keep that roof deck just a little bit warmer. Another option is something I touched on earlier called entangled mesh. Sometimes you might know it as Cedar Breather or Incamet. Another product out there is called Dry Tech. These products are about 1/4 of an inch thick, so they create about 1/4 of an inch air gap between the metal and the roof deck, again, creating that thermal break. Any of these spaces you can create like this can also help with sound attenuation, by the way. An added bonus of the entangled meshes beneath standing seam roofs is they can also help alleviate oil canning because the thickness of the mesh puts just a slight crown in the panels and the ripples go away from the metal panels as well. The other thing that you can consider in the absence of having proper ventilation is to use a breathable underlayment. A breathable underlayment is still going to be limited in effectiveness by anything else that's on the roof deck, such as other underlayments or old shingles. But a breathable underlayment can allow water vapor to pass through the decking to some degree rather than condense in or on the decking. Again, this is not a substitute for proper ventilation, but sometimes you can do these things to kind of lessen the chance of condensation in the absence of having proper ventilation. So combining the breathable underlayment with an entangled mesh will also be helpful because the entangled mesh then will create sort of an evaporation and drainage plane so that as vapor drives through the underlayment, it hits that entangled mesh and it has a place to condense and evaporate and drain off the roof if necessary. So that pretty much covers what I wanted to cover, wraps up what I wanted to cover today. I'm happy to address any questions. Looks like we might have one in the chat. I encourage folks to reach out to me at easiest email is todd@asktoddmiller.com. I'm always happy to address to any of these subjects or to talk about specific projects or problems you might be running into. So I'm going to stop sharing here, Caitlin, and I see we've got a couple questions maybe.
We do. The first question is coming in from Guillermo Diaz. And do you recommend insulated metal panels?
Certainly for the right application, insulated panels are great. We haven't seen a lot of those being used historically on steep slope roofs. We've seen them used more on low slope roofs and also as wall panels. But we are starting to see some of them on steep slope roofs as well. Again, you got to kind of look at the entire structure. I mean, generally speaking, with most conventional construction of the past, insulation up on the top of the roof wasn't necessarily the place to put insulation. But when you've got cathedral ceilings and so forth, it's the only place you can put it. And so it is where you have to put it. So Guillermo, I just say, it depends a lot on the application. There are lots of great insulated panels out there with metal skins that will do a great job for you for a lot of applications, though.
Perfect. Well, that seems to be the only question that has come through. So I'm going to start the outro process, and as any questions come through, I'll share them with you, Todd. So thank you so much, everybody, for joining us today. We truly appreciate your time and participation in today's METALCON Online webinar. We hope to see you all at a future METALCON Online, and we hope to see you all in person at METALCON this year. Todd, our lovely speaker, is presenting 2 different topics. So make sure you check back for additional information on those. A very, very big thank you to the MCA and especially Todd Miller for doing this presentation today. Todd, thank you so much for sharing your insights and expertise in this industry. We so appreciate it. And we will talk to you all at the next METALCON Online. Have a great day, everybody, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you. Oh, hey, there is a question here, Kaylin. Can I look at that real quick?
Can you
Um,
answer a good way to determine the best system to offer to customers?
Answer a good way to determine the best system to offer to customers. I think a lot of it depends upon the type of structure in your where you're at and what type of roof system is going to be most commonplace and what the market is that you're going after. METALCON is a great place to go discover those products that are out there, though. And so METALCON in Atlanta, the end of October, will be a great opportunity to see what products are out there, to discuss with the manufacturers and suppliers what might work well for buildings and projects in your area.
That's perfect. All right. Well, that'll be all for today, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us, Todd. Thank you again for presenting.
Thank you, Callan. It's great.